Hey everyone, today we're tackling a question most people won't touch. Was Lucrezia Borgia a master manipulator who seduced and poisoned her way through Renaissance Italy, or just a perfect pawn in her family's power games? Forget the sanitized version. The truth is stranger and more revealing. Imagine this, the corrupt heart of Renaissance Rome, where popes have mistresses, cardinals plot murders, and at the center of it all, a golden-haired teenage girl whose very name would become synonymous with poison and seduction. But here's the thing about the Borgias. They were outsiders from the start. Spanish interlopers in an Italian world. And nothing makes enemies faster than being foreign, successful, and unapologetic about your ambition. The Borgia name became a lightning rod for every dark rumor imaginable. But how much was true? That's what we're unpacking today. The real Lucrezia Borgia. Separating fact from the centuries of fiction that have transformed her into a femme fatale of historic proportions. Born in 1480, Lucrezia entered a world where women were political currency, where marriages were military alliances, and where her father, Rodrigo Borgia, was already climbing the ranks of the Catholic Church, despite fathering at least 7 illegitimate children. Yeah, different times, folks. Her early childhood was relatively normal for a Renaissance noblewoman. Education in languages, music, and the arts. But everything changed in 1492 when her father achieved the unthinkable. Through what many alleged was extensive bribery, and trust me, Renaissance papal elections were about as clean as a gas station bathroom. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. Suddenly, 13-year-old Lucrezia wasn't just any nobleman's daughter. She was the Pope's daughter, a walking, talking diplomatic asset. And in Renaissance Italy, diplomatic assets got married. Quickly and strategically. Let's pause for a second to appreciate the magnificent absurdity of this situation. The Pope, God's representative on earth, was openly acknowledging his illegitimate daughter and using her as a political chess piece. The hypocrisy was so thick you could spread it on toast. But this was Renaissance Rome, where power trumped piety every day of the week. Lucrezia's brother Cesare was forced into the church despite having zero religious inclination, because nepotism was basically official papal policy. Meanwhile, her other brother Juan became the military leader of the Papal States. The Borgias were the ultimate family business, with Pope Alexander as CEO, Cesare as the ruthless COO, Juan as head of security, and Lucrezia. She was their most valuable foreign diplomat. Except her diplomatic missions took place in the bedroom. This is where the rumors begin to swirl around Lucrezia. Was she a willing participant in her family's schemes? A master manipulator herself? Or was she simply following orders, a teenager with no real choice in how her life unfolded? To understand Lucrezia, we first need to understand the Renaissance marriage market. This wasn't about love, folks. Marriage was a military alliance with sex. It was a business merger that produced heirs, and the Borgias were looking to expand their business aggressively. So in 1493, at just 13, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, connecting the Borgias to the powerful Sforza family of Milan. This is marriage as geopolitics, a human treaty signed with wedding vows. And for a while, it served its purpose. But in politics, alliances shift, and when they do, marriages become inconvenient. 4 years later, the Borgias no longer needed the Sforza connection. In fact, it was becoming a liability as they pursued an alliance with Naples. There was just one small problem. Lucrezia was still married. But when your dad's the Pope, annulments get a whole lot easier. Pope Alexander VI wanted the marriage dissolved. Giovanni Sforza, understandably, wasn't thrilled about this career-damaging development. And here's where things get messy. When powerful men feel cornered, they often lash out. And Sforza lashed out with one of the most damaging allegations possible. He claimed the real reason the Borgias wanted the marriage annulled was because Lucrezia was having an incestuous relationship with her own father, the Pope. And just like that, the reputation of Lucrezia Borgia began its dark transformation. One man's desperate allegation would snowball over centuries into the image of Lucrezia we often see today, the poison ring-wearing seductress with no moral boundaries. But was there any truth to it? Or was this just the Renaissance equivalent of revenge porn? A spurned man trying to destroy a woman's reputation because he couldn't control her? Welcome back, history detectives. We left off with Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia's first husband, spreading incest rumors about the Borgias after they tried to annul his marriage. It's worth noting that no one really believed him at the time. Even the Sforza family told Giovanni to shut up and take the annulment. But that doesn't make for spicy historical drama. So the allegations stuck around like gum on the bottom of Lucrezia's historical shoe. The Borgias had a better plan for getting rid of Giovanni. They didn't need poison or daggers. They had canon law. The official grounds for annulment? Non-consummation due to Giovanni's impotence. Ouch. Imagine being a Renaissance nobleman having to publicly admit you couldn't seal the deal in the bedroom. That's not just embarrassing, that's reputation-ending stuff. Giovanni refused to admit impotence, hence his desperate counter-accusation about incest. But when the Pope offers you a choice between admitting you can't perform or potentially losing everything, including possibly your life, well, Giovanni eventually signed the papers declaring his permanent impotence, and the marriage was history. Here's where I need to make something crystal clear. This section discusses historical allegations about private life in Renaissance Italy. No graphic detail. We're focusing on political implications and source bias. The incest allegations against the Borgias came primarily from political enemies and hostile sources. Renaissance politics was played through rumor and reputation destruction as much as through armies and assassinations. Character assassination was just part of the political toolkit. And nothing assassinated character more effectively than sexual scandal. And the Borgias had enemies. So many enemies. They were Spanish outsiders in an Italian world. Alexander VI was reforming the Vatican in ways that threatened entrenched Italian noble families. Plus, the Borgias were just so unapologetically ambitious that they might as well have painted targets on their backs. Let's talk about sources for a moment. Much of what we know about Lucrezia comes from people who absolutely despised her family. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, kept detailed diaries that included every scandalous rumor without much fact-checking. Francesco Guicciardini, a Florentine historian, was politically opposed to the Borgias and repeated every wild tale. And later writers like Victor Hugo transformed Lucrezia from a person into a literary archetype of feminine evil. It's like getting all your information about a politician exclusively from their most rabid opponents, then treating those opinions as established fact for the next 5 centuries. Not exactly rigorous historical methodology. But back to Lucrezia. After her annulment, the 17-year-old was quickly remarried, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This was the alliance the Borgias really wanted. Lucrezia actually seemed happy in this marriage, but happiness wasn't a priority in Renaissance power politics. When the Borgias' foreign policy shifted again, pivoting from an alliance with Naples to one with France, Alfonso became a liability. In 1500, he was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, then strangled in his bed weeks later, while still recovering from his wounds. The official Borgia position. How terrible. Who could have done such a thing? Everyone else in Rome. Are you kidding me right now? Lucrezia was reportedly devastated. She was 20 years old and had already been through a politically motivated marriage, a humiliating annulment, a second marriage, and now widowhood by political assassination, almost certainly ordered by her own brother Cesare. This is where some of the poison rumors begin. Later, hostile sources would suggest Lucrezia learned the art of poisoning from her family and participated in these political eliminations. But contemporary accounts actually show her grief-stricken and sent away from Rome to recover. Think about Lucrezia's position. She's trapped in a political machine run by her father and brother. Her value to them is primarily in whom she can marry. She has very little agency in a world where women are property, not people. Is this the profile of a master manipulator? Or of someone being manipulated? At this point, Lucrezia was given temporary control of the city of Nepi, where she could mourn away from Rome. This is actually our first glimpse of Lucrezia operating independently, and she proved to be a competent administrator. This small taste of autonomy wouldn't last long, though. By 1501, the Borgias were already arranging her third marriage, this time aiming even higher. Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This was a major coup for the Borgias. The Este family was one of the oldest and most prestigious in Italy, and they were initially reluctant to connect themselves to the scandalous Borgias. The negotiations were intense. The Este family demanded an enormous dowry to compensate for marrying their heir to a twice-married woman with a reputation tarnished by her family's scandals. They got it. 100 ducats, cities, jewels, and expensive clothes. Lucrezia Borgia was literally worth a fortune in Renaissance marriage politics. You've got to wonder what was going through Lucrezia's mind at this point. At 21, she'd already been used as a political pawn repeatedly, with her personal happiness completely irrelevant to the men controlling her life. Now she was being essentially sold to a new family, packaged with territorial concessions and cash to sweeten the deal. Was she resigned to her fate? Was she secretly orchestrating events behind the scenes? Or was she developing her own survival strategies in a world where she had limited official power, but significant, unofficial influence? We're about to find out, because this third marriage would finally take Lucrezia away from direct Borgia control, and show us who she really was when she could partially step out from under her family's shadow. All right, let's pick up with Lucrezia's third marriage to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. The wedding celebrations were, to put it mildly, excessive. Pope Alexander VI wasn't subtle about his joy in securing this prestigious alliance. The festivities included elaborate pageants, bullfights, and theatrical performances that went on for days. Nothing says, "We've arrived in high society," quite like bankrupting the papal treasury for wedding entertainment. But here's the interesting part. Lucrezia actually did something unexpected. She made this marriage work, despite it being just as politically motivated as her previous ones. The transition wasn't easy. When she arrived in Ferrara in February 1502, the reception was chilly. The Este family had only accepted this marriage under political pressure and financial incentives. Lucrezia was still tainted by Borgia scandals and rumors. She was an outsider. Again, her new husband Alfonso wasn't exactly thrilled either. He had a long-term mistress he was quite content with, and now he had to marry this political liability with a questionable reputation. But Lucrezia, showing a political savvy that people often overlook, set about systematically winning over both her husband and the people of Ferrara. She adapted to Ferrara's more conservative court. She patronized artists, poets, and musicians, creating a cultural scene that brought prestige to the city. She was charitable and accessible to common people. In short, she launched a Renaissance reputation rehabilitation campaign that was remarkably effective. Even her relationship with Alfonso improved after a rocky start. They eventually had several children together, suggesting the marriage became more than just a political arrangement. Now I know what you're thinking. But what about the poison rings? The secret murders? The incest? All the stuff that makes Lucrezia Borgia a staple of historical scandals? Well, here's where history gets inconvenient for those who want a simple villain. In Ferrara, away from her family's direct influence, Lucrezia showed herself to be intelligent, pious, diplomatic, and an effective administrator. Not exactly the resume of a depraved poisoner. But just when Lucrezia was establishing her new life, everything changed. In August 1503, both Pope Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia became seriously ill with what was likely malaria. Alexander died, while Cesare eventually recovered. This was catastrophic for Borgia power. Without Alexander as pope, their entire political foundation crumbled. Cesare tried desperately to maintain control, but his enemies closed in quickly. The Borgia Empire had been built on papal authority, and that authority died with Alexander. For Lucrezia, this meant a dramatic shift in her position. She went from being the daughter of the most powerful man in Italy to being a potential liability for her new family. The Estes had married her for the Borgia connection, and that connection had just lost all its value. This is where we see Lucrezia's true political skills emerge. Rather than becoming marginalized, she successfully repositioned herself as a valuable Este ally rather than a Borgia agent. She distanced herself from her family's collapsing fortunes while solidifying her position in Ferrara. Let's pause for a moment and address the famous poison allegations. Ancient biographers writing decades later, often with political grudges, report that Lucrezia wore a hollow ring containing poison to eliminate enemies at dinner parties. Modern scholars treat this as contested at best, completely fabricated at worst. There's literally zero contemporary evidence that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. The poison ring story appears to be a complete fabrication that emerged well after her lifetime, borrowing from earlier legends about Nero and other evil historical figures. The association of the Borgias with poison was certainly present during their lifetime, but it was directed primarily at Alexander and Cesare, not Lucrezia. In fact, we have far more evidence of Lucrezia's diplomatic skills than any murderous tendencies. When Alfonso became duke after his father's death, Lucrezia often ruled Ferrara as regent during his absences. The diplomatic correspondence from this period shows her to be a careful, thoughtful leader who maintained peace and stability. Not exactly the bloodthirsty seductress of legend, is she? But the legends persisted because they served a purpose. The image of Lucrezia as a poisoning femme fatale became useful shorthand for criticizing powerful women. It reinforced the idea that women who exerted influence were inherently unnatural, probably immoral, and possibly murderous. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in history. When men are ruthless political operators, they're often remembered as strong leaders or strategic geniuses. When women display political acumen, they're transformed into monsters, seductresses, or witches. Lucrezia Borgia, Catherine de' Medici, Cleopatra, all received similar posthumous character assassinations. By 1508, Lucrezia had firmly established herself in Ferrara. She maintained a court that attracted artists and literary figures. She engaged in charitable works that won public support. She produced heirs for the Este dynasty. She managed diplomatic correspondence with skill. And when needed, she governed competently. All this raises an interesting question. Was this the real Lucrezia finally emerging from her family's shadow? Or had she been this person all along, but obscured by the Borgia reputation and her father and brother's control? The evidence suggests that Lucrezia had always been politically astute, but her earlier marriages had given her little room to demonstrate these abilities independently. In Ferrara, with more autonomy and distance from her notorious family, she could finally deploy her skills for her own benefit rather than as a tool of Borgia ambition. But even as Lucrezia built this new life, the shadows of her past weren't entirely gone. Her brother Cesare, once the terror of Italy, had fallen completely from power. After initially being imprisoned in Spain, he escaped and died fighting as a mercenary in 1507. The mighty Borgia dynasty that had dominated Italian politics was essentially extinct within a few years of Pope Alexander's death. Only Lucrezia remained in a position of influence, having successfully transitioned from Borgia daughter to Este duchess. That's not the achievement of a passive victim. It's the work of a shrewd political survivor. Welcome back to our deep dive into the life behind the legend of Lucrezia Borgia. We've seen how she successfully transitioned from being a Borgia asset to establishing herself as the Duchess of Ferrara. Now let's explore another dimension of Lucrezia that gets overshadowed by the poisoner myth: her role as a patron of Renaissance arts and culture. In Ferrara, Lucrezia created one of the most vibrant cultural courts in Italy. She patronized artists, poets, and musicians, not just as status symbols, but out of genuine appreciation. Remember, she had received an excellent humanist education as a child, unusual even for noble women of her time. The famous poet Pietro Bembo was so taken with Lucrezia that he wrote passionate letters to her that survive today. Their relationship appears to have been primarily intellectual and platonic, a meeting of minds rather than bodies, but it produced some of the most beautiful prose of the Italian Renaissance. The poet Ludovico Ariosto praised Lucrezia in his epic poem Orlando Furioso, comparing her to the Roman Republican heroine Lucretia, a deliberate contrast to the immoral reputation her enemies promoted. Artists like Titian and Dosso Dossi worked under her patronage. This doesn't square with the image of a depraved poisoner, does it? But that's exactly the point. The historical Lucrezia and the legendary Lucrezia are almost completely different people. Let's talk about something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Renaissance women: motherhood as a political act. Lucrezia gave birth to at least 8 children, though not all survived to adulthood. Childhood mortality was devastatingly common in this era. As the mother of Este heirs, she secured her position in ways that political maneuvering alone couldn't accomplish. Each successful pregnancy and birth strengthened her standing. Each child, especially each son, was a piece of biological diplomacy that bound her more firmly to Ferrara's future. In an era when noble marriages could be annulled or set aside, as she knew all too well, Children were a woman's most reliable security. Lucrezia suffered several miscarriages and difficult pregnancies throughout her life. These medical challenges were dangerous in an age before modern healthcare, and they took a toll on her health. Yet she continued to fulfill this expected role, understanding that her reproductive capacity was inseparable from her political position. This isn't the glamorous side of Renaissance politics, but it's arguably where Lucrezia showed her greatest personal courage. Each pregnancy was a potentially life-threatening ordeal, undertaken for dynastic purposes. This physical reality shaped the lives of royal and noble women in ways that male historians have often minimized or overlooked entirely. In 1512, something unexpected happened that tested Lucrezia's diplomatic skills. Pope Julius II, a sworn enemy of the Borgias who had helped dismantle their power after Alexander's death, formed the Holy League against France. This put Ferrara in a dangerous position, as the Este family had been allied with the French. With Ferrara under threat, Lucrezia took an active role in negotiations. She corresponded directly with cardinals and ambassadors, leveraging her connections and reputation to protect her adopted city. Contemporary diplomatic reports describe her as shrewd, persuasive, and indefatigable in these efforts. This is a far cry from the passive pawn or the one-dimensional seductress of legend. This is a woman actively engaging in high-stakes Renaissance diplomacy, using every tool available to her. Her education, her connections, her status, and yes, her personal charm, to achieve specific political goals. In 1518, Lucrezia experienced personal tragedy when her husband's illegitimate son, Giulio, who was himself involved in a failed conspiracy against Alfonso, was imprisoned rather than executed. Lucrezia had pleaded for his life, showing mercy that contradicts the ruthless image later attributed to her. Throughout this period, we also see evidence of Lucrezia's religious devotion. While her father's approach to the church had been nakedly political, Lucrezia displayed a more genuine piety. She maintained connections with various convents, supported religious orders financially, and engaged in traditional devotional practices. Some historians have suggested this religiosity was mere public relations, image management for a woman with a controversial past. But the consistency and privacy of many of her devotions suggest something more genuine. This doesn't mean Lucrezia was a secret saint, but it does further complicate the one-dimensional villainess of legend. By 1519, at age 39, Lucrezia had established herself as one of the most respected female rulers in Italy. She had overcome the Borgia stigma, proven herself an able administrator and diplomat, produced heirs for the Este dynasty, and created a cultural court that enhanced Ferrara's prestige throughout Europe. Then, in June 1519, she gave birth to her 8th child, a daughter named Isabella Maria. The birth was difficult, and complications followed. Lucrezia developed a puerperal fever, a common and often fatal postpartum infection in the pre-antibiotic era. Despite the efforts of her doctors, Lucrezia Borgia died on June 24, 1519, 10 days after giving birth. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, wearing the habit of a tertiary Franciscan, reflecting her religious devotion. The irony is painful. The woman whose name would become synonymous with poison and murder actually died from the most common cause of death for Renaissance women: childbirth complications. Not from a dagger in the dark or a dramatic poisoned chalice, but from the biological reality that defined women's lives and risks regardless of their power or position. Alfonso d'Este, the husband whose political alliance had been the only initial reason for their marriage, was genuinely grieved by her death. He wrote that Lucrezia had been exemplary as a wife, and that he had been most satisfied with her. High praise in an era when marriages were primarily political transactions. With Lucrezia's death, the actual historical figure began to fade, allowing the legend to grow unchecked. Without her presence to contradict the lurid stories, the mythical Lucrezia, poisoner, seductress, embodiment of feminine evil, began to take stronger hold on the European imagination. Let's follow the fascinating transformation of Lucrezia Borgia from a complex historical figure into a full-blown cultural archetype of feminine evil. Because honestly, this posthumous character assassination is almost more interesting than her actual life. After her death in 1519, the real Lucrezia, the capable administrator, diplomatic negotiator, and cultural patron, began to fade from memory. In her place emerged an increasingly sensationalized character, who embodied Renaissance fears about powerful women and female sexuality. The process started even during her lifetime, but accelerated after she wasn't around to contradict it. The incest allegations from her first husband Giovanni Sforza, which few believed at the time, were revived and embellished. The Borgia association with poison, primarily directed at her father and brother during their lives, was transferred to Lucrezia and magnified. By the end of the 16th century, just decades after her death, Lucrezia was already being portrayed in popular accounts as a poisoner who eliminated political enemies at dinner parties. The infamous poison ring story, completely absent from contemporary accounts, had become an established fact. Fast forward to the 19th century, and Lucrezia hit the Victorian-era pop culture jackpot when Victor Hugo wrote his drama Lucrezia Borgia in 1833. This work portrayed her as the incestuous poisoner of legend with zero historical accuracy, but maximum dramatic effect. When Gaetano Donizetti adapted it into an opera the same year, Lucrezia's transformation into a cultural villain was complete. What's so fascinating about this process is how it reveals more about the cultures doing the transforming than about Lucrezia herself. Each era projected its own anxieties about women onto Lucrezia's memory. For the Victorians, she became a cautionary tale about feminine sexuality and corruption, the opposite of their domestic angel ideal. In the 20th century, Hollywood picked up the baton. Films like Bride of Vengeance, 1949, continued portraying Lucrezia as a seductive manipulator, though occasionally with a bit more nuance as a pawn in male power games. It wasn't really until the late 20th century that historians began seriously reassessing Lucrezia based on primary sources rather than centuries of accumulated legend. Scholars like Maria Belanci and Sarah Bradford produced biographies that stripped away the mythology and revealed a more complex and frankly more interesting historical figure. This is where we need to ask an important question. Why did Lucrezia Borgia, specifically, become such a powerful symbol of feminine evil? Why not the countless other women in Renaissance politics who engaged in similar behavior? Part of the answer lies in the Borgia name itself. The entire family had acquired a reputation for ruthlessness and amorality, some deserved, some exaggerated by their enemies. As the most prominent female Borgia, Lucrezia inherited this family reputation, and then had it specifically gendered in ways her male relatives didn't. When Cesare Borgia ordered assassinations, he was seen as a ruthless Renaissance prince, morally questionable, but operating within the understood rules of power politics. When rumors suggested Lucrezia was involved in similar eliminations, she became unnatural, monstrous, a perversion of proper womanhood. This double standard appears consistently throughout history. Male power, even when violently expressed, is generally portrayed as natural and orderly. Female power is often characterized as chaotic, sexual, and dangerous, a disruption of the proper order. Another factor was Lucrezia's beauty, which contemporary accounts consistently praised. The combination of physical beauty and alleged moral corruption created a particularly potent archetype, the seductive poisoner whose external beauty masked internal corruption. This is a trope we see repeatedly in literature and art, reflecting deep cultural anxieties about feminine power and its potential to subvert male authority. The incest allegations added another layer of transgression that made Lucrezia particularly useful as a symbol. By portraying her as sexually corrupt in the most extreme way imaginable, her enemies effectively removed her from the category of woman altogether and placed her in the realm of the monstrous. Let's be absolutely clear. There is no credible historical evidence that Lucrezia engaged in incestuous relationships. These allegations originated with a disgruntled ex-husband and were amplified by political enemies of the Borgia family. They represent character assassination, not historical fact. Similarly, there is no contemporary evidence that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. The poison ring stories emerged decades after her death and belong to legend, not history. Yet these elements became the core of her posthumous identity, almost completely eclipsing the actual person revealed in diplomatic correspondence, government records, and contemporary accounts. What's particularly ironic about Lucrezia's legendary status as a poisoner is that her father and brother were far more plausibly connected to political assassinations. Yet they're often portrayed with a certain admiration for their Machiavellian qualities. while Lucretia is reduced to a sexual deviant with a poison ring. If we step back and look at the historical record objectively, what we see is a woman who successfully navigated the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics despite limited formal power. She transformed herself from a Borgia marriage pawn into a respected duchess who ruled effectively in her husband's absence. She built alliances, managed crises, and protected her children's interests with skill and determination. In other words, she did exactly what Renaissance princes were expected to do. She exercised power effectively to maintain stability and advance her family's interests. Her methods were diplomatic rather than military, and she operated within the constraints that gender imposed on her, but her political acumen was real and substantial. Yet instead of being remembered as a capable female ruler, like Isabella of Castile or Elizabeth I, Lucrezia became a cautionary tale about female sexuality and ambition. Her actual accomplishments were buried beneath layers of sensationalism that served the cultural needs of later eras. This pattern of posthumous transformation isn't unique to Lucrezia. We see it with other powerful women throughout history: Cleopatra, Catherine de' Medici, Marie Antoinette, all of whom had their actual lives and accomplishments overshadowed by sexualized or demonized legendary versions that say more about cultural anxieties than historical reality. The tragedy is that these distortions don't just misrepresent individuals, they actively erase female political agency from our understanding of history. By transforming capable female rulers into seductresses, poisoners, or witches, these narratives imply that women can only exercise power through sexuality or deviance, never through the same political skills we readily acknowledge in men. Let's get back to our central question. Was Lucrezia Borgia a seductive weapon wielded by her family, or a perfect victim of their ambitions and subsequent historical character assassination? The answer, as with most interesting historical questions, isn't a simple either-or. The evidence suggests something more nuanced. A woman who began as a political pawn but developed increasing agency throughout her life, learning to navigate a system designed to limit her autonomy. Consider her 3 marriages. In the first, to Giovanni Sforza, she was clearly a diplomatic tool with little say in the arrangement. She was 13, completely under her father's control, and the marriage was purely strategic. When that strategy changed, the marriage was annulled, with equally little input from Lucrezia. Her second marriage, to Alfonso of Aragon, showed slightly more complexity. While still arranged for political purposes, contemporary accounts suggest Lucrezia developed genuine affection for this husband. When he was murdered, almost certainly on her brother Cesare's orders, Lucrezia appeared genuinely grieved and was sent away from Rome to recover. This second marriage reveals the first significant tension between Lucrezia's personal feelings and her family's political machinations. She was still primarily a tool of Borgia ambition, but we can see the beginnings of her own distinct perspective and emotional life emerging in the historical record. It's the third marriage, to Alfonso d'Este, where Lucrezia's agency becomes most visible. Although initially arranged like the others, this marriage took her away from direct Borgia control. In Ferrara, with geographic and political distance from her father and brother, Lucrezia began to operate more independently. Her successful integration into Ferrarese society, her cultural patronage, her diplomatic work, and her effective governance as regent during her husband's absences all demonstrate political skills that were hers, not merely extensions of Borgia family strategy. This suggests a developmental arc, from pawn to player in her own right. The young Lucrezia had little choice but to follow her father's directives. The mature Duchess of Ferrara had developed the skills and built the networks to pursue her own objectives within the constraints Renaissance society placed on noble women. So was she weapon or victim? She began more as the latter and evolved toward a position of greater agency, though never with the freedom her male contemporaries enjoyed. She was both used by her family and increasingly capable of using the situations they created to her own advantage. Let's consider another angle on this question by examining Lucrezia's relationship with her infamous family members, particularly her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother Cesare Borgia. Contemporary accounts suggest Lucrezia had a close relationship with her father. Alexander clearly favored her, even beyond her value as a political asset. When she left Rome for Ferrara, he was reportedly deeply affected by her departure. Their correspondence shows genuine affection alongside political calculation. This doesn't mean we should credit the incest allegations, which remain thoroughly unsubstantiated. But it does suggest a complex father-daughter relationship, where genuine emotional bonds existed alongside Alexander's willingness to use Lucrezia as a political tool. Lucrezia's relationship with Cesare appears more complicated. Her brother was ruthlessly ambitious, willing to eliminate anyone who stood in his way, including Lucrezia's second husband. Yet the siblings maintained a connection even after she moved to Ferrara, with Lucrezia at times attempting to help Cesare after the collapse of Borgia power following Alexander's death. What emerges from these family dynamics is an image of Lucrezia as someone who maintained genuine familial bonds, while also developing the ability to distance herself strategically when necessary. She didn't repudiate her Borgia connections, even when it might have been politically expedient after her father's death, but she did establish an identity independent of her notorious family. This brings us to another dimension of agency that's often overlooked: Lucrezia's reproductive role. Renaissance noblewomen were expected to produce heirs, and Lucrezia fulfilled this duty with 8 pregnancies. But it would be a mistake to see this solely as passive submission to biological destiny. Successful childbearing strengthened Lucrezia's position in Ferrara. Each child, especially each son, made her more valuable to the Este dynasty and more difficult to set aside. In a very real sense, her reproductive success was a form of political capital in a system that gave women few formal avenues to power. The fact that she ultimately died from complications of childbirth underscores how central and dangerous this aspect of female political existence was in Renaissance Italy. Lucrezia's final pregnancy was both a fulfillment of her expected role and, tragically, the end of her increasing personal agency. Let's also consider Lucrezia's cultural activities as an expression of agency. Her patronage of artists, poets, and musicians wasn't just about status display, though that was certainly part of it. It also allowed her to shape her environment, influence cultural production, and create networks of obligation and loyalty outside the formal political structures that excluded women. When the poet Ariosto compared her to the Roman Republican heroine Lucretia, a deliberate contrast to her scandalous reputation, he wasn't just flattering his patron, he was participating in an image rehabilitation campaign that served Lucrezia's interests. This suggests she was actively managing her reputation, not simply accepting the narrative others created about her. All of this paints a picture of a woman developing and exercising agency within severe constraints, finding spaces for autonomy and self-definition in a world that generally denied these to women. Rather than either pure victim or pure manipulator, Lucrezia appears as someone learning to navigate between these extremes, carving out what independence she could in circumstances largely controlled by others. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Lucrezia's growing agency comes from the period after her father's death, when Borgia power collapsed. Had she been merely a Borgia instrument, her utility and status would have ended with her family's fall. Instead, she successfully repositioned herself as a valuable Este ally and continued to build her role in Ferrara. This adaptive ability to survive the dramatic reversal of her family's fortunes and establish a new identity independent of them suggests political skills that were genuinely her own, not simply reflexive implementation of Borgia family strategy. So our answer emerges. Lucrezia Borgia began as a victim of her family's ambitions, but gradually developed into a political actor in her own right, never achieving the full agency of her male contemporaries, but successfully creating space for autonomous action within the severe constraints of her time and station. Let's examine another critical aspect of Lucrezia Borgia's story that often gets overlooked: her education and intellectual life. In an era when female education was generally limited to basic religious instruction and domestic skills, Lucrezia received a humanist education, comparable to male nobles of her time. She was fluent in multiple languages: Italian, Spanish, French, and Latin. She could read Greek. She studied classical literature, history, and philosophy under reputable tutors. This intellectual foundation proved crucial to her later success in navigating Renaissance court politics and diplomacy. Her correspondence reveals a sharp mind and political astuteness. When acting as regent in Ferrara during her husband's absences, she handled complex administrative issues with evident competence. Contemporary diplomats, not given to praising female rulers, noted her intelligence and political judgment. This intellectual dimension contradicts the simplistic seductress image later attributed to her. The historical Lucretia relied on her education and political acumen at least as much as on her beauty or family connections. She was playing the Renaissance political game with the full range of tools available to her, not merely trading on sexuality as later legends would suggest. Another aspect worth exploring is Lucretia's religious life. Despite being the daughter of a corrupt pope and growing up in the morally flexible environment of Renaissance Rome, Lucrezia displayed consistent religious devotion throughout her life. In Ferrara, she maintained close relationships with several convents and religious orders. Her charitable activities focused significantly on religious institutions. In her personal devotions, she followed traditional Catholic practices with apparent sincerity. She chose to be buried in the habit of a Franciscan tertiary, a genuine expression of piety, not a public relations move, as it wasn't visible to the public. This religiosity doesn't fit neatly into either the seductive weapon or perfect victim framework. It suggests a dimension of Lucrezia's life that was neither calculated political manipulation nor imposed obligation, but rather personal conviction and choice. Now let's tackle one of the most persistent elements of the Lucrezia legend: the infamous poison ring supposedly used to eliminate enemies at dinner parties. This detail appears in no contemporary sources. It emerged decades after her death, likely borrowing from earlier legends about Nero and other notorious historical figures. The association of the Borgias with poison was certainly present during their lifetimes, but it was directed primarily at Alexander and Cesare, not Lucrezia. There's no credible evidence that Lucrezia ever poisoned anyone. This element of her legend appears to be pure fabrication, added to enhance her reputation as a feminine villain. What makes this particularly ironic is that if anyone in Renaissance Italy was eliminating opponents through poison or other means, it was far more likely to be the male political actors, including Lucrezia's father and brother, than Lucrezia herself. Yet the poison reputation attached more firmly to her in historical memory, reflecting gendered expectations about how power operates. When men ordered assassinations, it was seen as regrettable but understandable power politics. When women were alleged to do the same, it became evidence of unnatural, sexualized evil. This double standard shaped Lucrezia's posthumous reputation more than any actual historical evidence. Let's also examine Lucrezia's relationship with her various children, including those from different marriages and her husband's illegitimate offspring. Contemporary accounts suggest she was a devoted and protective mother who actively advocated for her children's interests. When her son, by Alfonso of Aragon, her second husband, was caught in the collapse of Borgia power after Alexander's death, Lucrezia worked diligently to protect him and secure his future. Similarly, she integrated her husband's illegitimate children into her household in Ferrara, treating them with apparent kindness rather than viewing them as threats or competitors. This maternal dimension doesn't fit the poisonous seductress image at all. It suggests a woman who, despite operating in the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics, maintained genuine family bonds and used her influence to protect those in her care, not just to advance her own position. Another revealing moment comes from the conspiracy against her husband Alfonso by his illegitimate brothers in 1506. When the plot was discovered, Alfonso wanted the conspirators executed. Lucrezia intervened for clemency, and as a result, they were imprisoned rather than killed. This act of mercy contradicts the ruthless image later attached to her. It suggests someone capable of compassion even in the context of Renaissance power politics, where merciless elimination of enemies was common practice. What's particularly striking about the real Lucrezia versus the legendary version is the disconnect between her actual methods and her posthumous reputation. The historical record shows a woman who primarily exercised power through diplomacy, cultural patronage, careful alliance building, and administrative competence, all relatively peaceful methods that worked within, rather than against, the social systems of her time. Yet she's remembered for allegedly violent, transgressive methods, poisoning, incest, sexual manipulation, that have little basis in contemporary evidence. This transformation tells us more about cultural anxieties surrounding female power than about Lucrezia herself. If we were to summarize the actual historical Lucrezia Borgia based on contemporary evidence rather than later legend, we'd see 1. A woman who began as a political pawn in her family's ambitions. 2. Who gradually developed political skills and increasingly exercised them independently. 3. Who successfully navigated the collapse of her family's power to establish herself in a new context. 4. Who governed competently when given the opportunity. Who built cultural and diplomatic networks that enhanced both her personal position and her adopted city's prestige. 6. Who fulfilled expected roles as wife and mother while finding space for personal agency within those constraints. 7. Who displayed intelligence, education, and political acumen that contradicts the one-dimensional seductress image. This Lucrezia, the historical rather than legendary figure, is actually far more interesting than the caricature that developed after her death. She represents the complex reality of female power in a period when women were formally excluded from political authority, but nonetheless found ways to exercise significant influence. Her story is not a simple morality tale about feminine evil or victimhood, but rather a nuanced account of how one intelligent woman navigated the treacherous intersection of gender, family obligation, and Renaissance power politics. By reducing her to either seductive manipulator or helpless victim, we miss the most historically significant and personally compelling aspects of Lucrezia Borgia. Her remarkable adaptability, her political learning curve, and her eventual transformation from Borgia marriage token to respected Duchess of Ferrara. As we approach our conclusion, let's address the central question posed in our title. Was Lucrezia Borgia a seductive weapon or a perfect victim? The historical evidence points to a trajectory that began closer to the latter and developed toward greater agency, though never reaching the mythical manipulator status later attributed to her. The young Lucrezia was undoubtedly a victim of Renaissance marriage politics and Borgia family ambition. Married at 13 to serve her father's strategic objectives, annulled when those objectives changed, remarried strategically, then widowed by what was likely her brother's assassination order. Her early life was defined by decisions made by the men controlling her fate, but with each transition, we see evidence of Lucrezia learning, adapting, and gradually gaining more control over her circumstances. By her third marriage, she had developed significant political and social skills that allowed her to transform a purely strategic alliance into a foundation for personal influence and respect. When Borgia power collapsed following Alexander VI's death, Lucrezia demonstrated remarkable resilience and adaptive capability. Rather than falling with her family, she successfully repositioned herself as a valuable ally and continued building her role in Ferrara, independent of her notorious relatives. This adaptive trajectory contradicts both the helpless victim and master manipulator narratives. It shows a woman gradually developing agency within severe constraints, never achieving the freedom her male contemporaries enjoyed, but nonetheless carving out spaces for autonomous action and personal influence. The legendary Lucrezia, the poisoner, the incestuous seductress, the embodiment of feminine evil, has almost no basis in contemporary evidence. These elements were added after her death, building on rumors started by political enemies and elaborated by later writers more interested in sensationalism than historical accuracy. This transformation from complex historical figure to cultural archetype reveals more about societal attitudes toward female power than about Lucrezia herself. When women exercised political influence, as Lucrezia did through diplomacy, cultural patronage, and administrative competence, cultural anxiety often recast their actions in sexual terms, transforming political agency into sexual deviance. The posthumous sexualization of Lucrezia's power reflects deep-seated discomfort with the idea of women operating in traditionally male domains. Rather than acknowledging her political skills, later accounts attributed her influence to seduction, poison, and moral corruption, explanations that reinforced rather than challenged gender hierarchies. What makes this particularly ironic is that the actual methods Lucrezia used to exercise influence, cultural patronage, diplomatic networking, careful alliance building, maternal advocacy for her children, were largely consistent with accepted female roles in Renaissance society. She worked within the system rather than against it, finding paths to influence that didn't directly challenge male authority. Yet she's remembered for allegedly transgressive methods, poisoning, incest, sexual manipulation, that have little historical basis. This distortion serves a clear cultural purpose, maintaining the narrative that female power is inherently unnatural and dangerous, achieved through deviance rather than skill. The historical Lucrezia stands in stark contrast to this legendary version. Contemporary sources show a woman who was 1. Educated and intelligent, fluent in multiple languages and conversant with Renaissance humanism. 2. Diplomatically skilled, maintaining correspondence networks and negotiating effectively during crises. 3. Administratively competent, governing Ferrara successfully during her husband's absences. 4. Culturally influential, creating a court that attracted leading artists and intellectuals. 5. Maternally devoted, actively protecting her children's interests across political transitions. 6. Religiously observant, maintaining relationships with religious institutions and personal devotional practices. 7. Adaptable and resilient, surviving dramatic political reversals that destroyed her male relatives. This multifaceted historical person is far more interesting, and ultimately more significant, than the one-dimensional villainess of legend. She represents the complex reality of how women navigated power in a period when they were formally excluded from authority, but nonetheless exercised considerable influence through informal channels. Lucrezia's evolution from political pawn to respected duchess reveals both the severe constraints Renaissance women faced and the spaces for agency they nonetheless created within those constraints. Her story isn't about either victimhood or villainous manipulation, but rather the complex middle ground where most historical women actually operated, negotiating systems they didn't create but couldn't simply ignore. So what's the final verdict? Lucrezia Borgia was neither purely victim nor purely weapon, but rather someone who began as the former and developed increasing agency throughout her life, without ever becoming the mythical manipulator of legend. She was a woman who learned to navigate Renaissance power politics from a position of formal disadvantage, using education, intelligence, and social skills to create space for autonomous action in a world designed to deny it to her. The legendary Lucrezia, the poisoner of countless novels, operas, and films, tells us more about cultural anxieties surrounding female power than about the historical person. By reclaiming the actual Lucrezia from beneath these layers of sensationalism, we gain insight not just into one remarkable woman's life, but into the broader patterns of how female political agency has been systematically obscured and distorted in our understanding of history. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't a perfect victim or a seductive weapon. She was something far more interesting and historically significant. A Renaissance woman who found ways to exercise genuine influence in a world that formally denied it to her gender, who survived the dramatic rise and fall of one of history's most notorious families, and who built a lasting legacy that deserved better than the sensationalized distortion it received. Her true story isn't about poison rings or incestuous relationships. It's about intelligence, adaptability, and the gradual development of political agency against significant odds, a narrative that offers more meaningful insights into both Renaissance politics and the perennial challenges of female power than any sensationalized legend could provide. Let's look at a crucial aspect of Lucrezia Borgia's story that's often overlooked: the political context of Renaissance Italy that shaped both her life and her posthumous reputation. This wasn't just any historical period, it was one of history's most notoriously cutthroat political environments. Renaissance Italian politics was a constantly shifting landscape of alliances, betrayals, and power plays. City-states and principalities competed and combined in kaleidoscopic patterns. Foreign powers, France and Spain particularly, intervened repeatedly. The papacy operated as both a spiritual authority and a territorial state with military ambitions. In this environment, the Borgias were distinctive, not because they were uniquely amoral, but because they were outsiders who played the game with unusual directness. They were Spanish in an Italian world, new money in old nobility circles, and unapologetically ambitious in a culture that preferred its power moves to be more elegantly disguised. This outsider status made the Borgias particularly vulnerable to character assassination. When Italian nobles engaged in assassination, bribery, or strategic marriages, it was politics as usual. When the Borgias did exactly the same things, it became evidence of their unique depravity, their Spanish or foreign moral corruption. Lucrezia, as the most prominent female Borgia, became a lightning rod for this anti-Borgia sentiment, which was often expressed through sexual allegations. This wasn't unique to her. Renaissance character assassination frequently used sexual accusations against women. But the combination of Borgia notoriety with female vulnerability made Lucrezia a particularly effective target. Understanding this context helps explain why Lucrezia's posthumous reputation became so detached from historical reality. She wasn't just any Renaissance noblewoman. She was a Borgia, a name that had already become shorthand for amoral political manipulation. The legends that accumulated around her built on this family reputation, transforming her from a woman who navigated Renaissance politics to one who supposedly embodied its worst excesses. This brings us to another important contextual factor: the position of noblewomen in Renaissance political systems. Women like Lucrezia operated in a paradoxical space where they had significant informal influence, but almost no formal authority. Marriage was explicitly political, creating alliances between families and states. Women were the human tokens that sealed these alliances, expected to transfer their loyalties from birth family to marriage family seamlessly. Yet they also maintained connection with their original families, often serving as informal diplomatic channels between competing powers. This dual role, loyal wife and family connection, placed women in inherently contradictory positions. They were simultaneously insiders and outsiders in their marital courts, trusted with significant responsibilities but always under suspicion of divided loyalties. Lucrezia navigated this contradictory position with remarkable skill, particularly after her father's death when Borgia connections became liabilities rather than assets. She successfully repositioned herself as a loyal duchess while maintaining enough Borgia ties to support her remaining family connections when possible. This political balancing act required intelligence, diplomatic skill, and careful reputation management, qualities the historical Lucrezia clearly possessed, but which are entirely absent from her legendary portrayal as a one-dimensional seductress or victim. Another contextual factor worth examining is the role of Renaissance historiography itself. The sources for Lucrezia's life include diplomatic correspondence, financial records, contemporary chronicles, and later histories, each with its own biases and limitations. Many of the most lurid allegations against Lucrezia come from sources written decades after her death, often by authors with clear political or cultural agendas. Johann Burchard's papal diaries include scandalous rumors, but present them as unverified hearsay. Francesco Guicciardini's History of Italy, written in the 1530s, presents Borgia corruption as a foregone conclusion, with little attempt at evidential support for specific allegations. These sources were then selectively mined by later writers looking for sensational material, creating a feedback loop where the most dramatic allegations were repeated and amplified while contradictory evidence was ignored. By the 19th century, when Victor Hugo wrote his drama Lucrezia Borgia, historical accuracy was entirely secondary to dramatic impact and moral messaging. This process of posthumous transformation wasn't unique to Lucrezia. We see similar patterns with other powerful women throughout history: Cleopatra, Messalina, Catherine de' Medici, all of whom had their actual lives obscured by legendary versions that served later cultural needs. What's particularly telling about Lucrezia's case is the stark contrast between contemporary assessments of her character and later legendary portraits. Those who actually knew her, including diplomats with no reason to flatter, generally described her as intelligent, gracious, and capable. Even her third husband, initially reluctant to marry her because of the Borgia reputation, came to respect and value her. Yet in historical memory, these contemporary assessments were overwhelmed by later sensationalism that transformed Lucrezia into an archetype rather than a person, the poisoning seductress whose external beauty masked internal corruption. This transformation tells us more about the cultures doing the transforming than about Lucrezia herself. The 19th century particularly, with its rigid dichotomy between the domestic angel and the fallen woman, found in Lucrezia a perfect negative example: the anti-Madonna, whose story reinforced cultural messaging about proper female behavior and the dangers of feminine power. What makes this particularly ironic is that the historical Lucrezia operated largely within accepted female roles of her time. She was a diplomatic wife, a devoted mother, a cultural patron, a religious donor, all acceptable activities for Renaissance noblewomen. Her influence came not from transgressing gender boundaries, but from skillfully using the limited avenues available to her. Yet she's remembered for allegedly transgressive behaviors: poisoning, incest, sexual manipulation, that have little historical basis. This distortion served clear cultural purposes, reinforcing rather than challenging gender hierarchies by suggesting that female power is inherently unnatural and dangerous. The real Lucrezia Borgia was neither the perfect victim of her family's ambitions nor the seductive weapon of later legend. She was a Renaissance noblewoman who began with limited options but gradually developed political skills that allowed her increasing agency within the severe constraints of her time and station. Her story offers valuable insights into how women navigated power in periods when they were formally excluded from authority. She didn't directly challenge the system, that wasn't a viable option, but she found spaces within it for meaningful action and personal influence. This more nuanced understanding doesn't fit neatly into either the victim or villain narrative. It requires acknowledging both the severe limitations Renaissance women faced and the genuine agency many nonetheless managed to exercise within those constraints. By reclaiming Lucrezia from beneath layers of posthumous sensationalism, we gain a more accurate understanding not just of one remarkable woman's life, but of how female political agency has been systematically distorted in our historical memory, transformed from complex reality into simplistic archetypes serving later cultural agendas. As we reach our conclusion, let's directly address our central question once more. Was Lucrezia Borgia a seductive weapon or a perfect victim? The historical evidence we've examined points to a more complex reality that transcends this binary framing. The young Lucrezia was undoubtedly used as a political tool by her ambitious family. Married 3 times for strategic advantage, she began her political life with minimal agency, following the directives of her father and brother. In this early period, she was much closer to victim than weapon in the Borgia family arsenal. But what makes Lucrezia's story compelling is her evolution. With each marriage and political transition, we see evidence of her developing skills, networks, and personal strategies. By the time she was established in Ferrara, she was operating with considerable independence, particularly after her father's death removed direct Borgia influence. This developmental arc suggests neither pure victim nor pure manipulator, but rather a woman learning to navigate an inherently restrictive system, finding spaces for autonomous action within severe constraints. She began with few choices, but gradually expanded her range of effective action through intelligence, education, and political acumen. When Borgia power collapsed after Alexander VI's death in 1503, Lucrezia demonstrated remarkable adaptive capability. Rather than falling with her family's fortunes, she successfully repositioned herself as a valuable Este asset and continued building her role in Ferrara independent of her notorious relatives. This transition alone indicates political skills that were genuinely her own, not merely an extension of Borgia family strategy. The legendary Lucrezia, the poisoner, the incestuous seductress, the embodiment of feminine evil, has almost no basis in contemporary evidence. These elements were added after her death, building on rumors started by political enemies and elaborated by later writers more interested in sensationalism than historical accuracy. What's particularly revealing about this posthumous transformation is how it systematically erased Lucrezia's actual methods of exercising influence. The historical record shows a woman who operated primarily through diplomacy, cultural patronage, alliance building, and administrative competence, all relatively acceptable avenues for female influence in Renaissance society. Yet she's remembered for allegedly transgressive methods, poisoning, incest, sexual manipulation, that have little historical basis. This distortion served clear cultural purposes, reinforcing rather than challenging gender hierarchies by suggesting that female power operates through deviance rather than skill. This pattern of posthumous transformation isn't unique to Lucrezia. We see it repeatedly with powerful women throughout history, whose actual lives and achievements are obscured by sexualized or demonized legendary versions that say more about cultural anxieties than historical reality. What makes Lucrezia's case particularly instructive is the stark contrast between contemporary assessments and later legend. Those who actually knew her generally described her as intelligent, gracious, and capable. Even her third husband, initially reluctant to marry her because of the Borgia reputation, came to respect and value her. Yet in historical memory, these assessments were overwhelmed by sensationalism that transformed Lucrezia into an archetype rather than a person. By reclaiming the historical Lucrezia from beneath these layers of legend, we gain insight not just into one remarkable woman's life, but into broader patterns of how female political agency has been systematically distorted in our understanding of history. The real Lucrezia Borgia wasn't a perfect victim or a seductive weapon. She was something far more interesting and historically significant. A Renaissance woman who found ways to exercise genuine influence in a world that formally denied it to her gender, who survived the dramatic rise and fall of one of history's most notorious families, and who built a lasting legacy that deserved better than the sensationalized distortion it received. Her story challenges us to develop more nuanced understandings of historical women's lives, recognizing both the severe constraints they faced and the genuine agency many nonetheless managed to exercise within those constraints. It reminds us to look beyond the sensationalized archetypes that often dominate historical memory and seek the complex human realities beneath. In the end, the most accurate answer to our title question is this. Lucrezia Borgia began as a victim of Renaissance marriage politics and Borgia family ambition, gradually developed into a skilled political actor in her own right, and was then posthumously transformed into a legendary seductress that bore little resemblance to the historical person. This three-stage transformation, from pawn to player to posthumous archetype, tells us as much about how gender shapes historical memory as it does about Lucrezia herself. Her legend reflects cultural anxieties about female power that have persistently transformed capable women into either victims or villains, denying them the complex agency that male historical figures are routinely granted. The real Lucrezia's story is ultimately about resilience, adaptation, and the development of personal agency against significant odds, a narrative that offers more meaningful historical insights than any sensationalized legend. By recovering this more complex reality, we do justice not only to Lucrezia herself, but to the countless historical women whose actual lives and achievements have been obscured by similar processes of posthumous transformation. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't history's greatest monster or its most perfect victim. She was a Renaissance woman navigating power from a position of formal disadvantage, finding spaces for meaningful action in a world that sought to deny them to her, and leaving a legacy that deserves to be remembered for its genuine accomplishments rather than legendary distortions. In separating the historical Lucrezia from her legendary afterlife, we recover not just one woman's story, but a more accurate understanding of how gender has shaped both the exercise of power and its historical representation, an understanding that remains relevant as we continue to grapple with the complex relationships between gender, power, and historical memory in our own time.